Well, it's a legal showdown. Premier Doug Ford is using what some call the constitutional red button, the notwithstanding clause, or section 33 of the charter, and he's doing it to override a judge's ruling that concluded his legislation to slash Toronto City Council on half in the midst of a municipal election violates people's charter of rights and freedoms. But Ford is standing firm and says he won't hesitate to use the notwithstanding clause in the future. Does it set a dangerous precedent across the country, or, as his defenders argue, is this exactly what he should be doing to get his agenda passed? Let's bring in the Scrum to talk about that. Christy Kirkup is a reporter with the Canadian Press. Bob Fife, you know him, the Ottawa bureau chief for the Globe and Mail. Also, Craig Oliver is CTV's chief political commentator. He's back. And our special guest today is the former Ontario Premier and current Liberal MPP, Kathleen Wynne. Well, welcome back. Let me start with you, Kathleen Wynne. I don't suspect you're going to defend Doug Ford's use of the notwithstanding clause, but he has the right to use it. Why do you believe it's wrong to use it in this case?
Yeah, we're not talking about whether he has the power or the authority to use it. We all know he does. I think that there are a number of problems with what he's doing. There was no mention of this, so nobody expected that he was going to make this change. And so using the notwithstanding clause to do something that no one expected, I think, is unacceptable. There's no evidence that the notwithstanding clause is necessary. It was designed for situations where there was an emergency or where it was a serious issue, and that there was evidence that it needed to be done. We have no evidence of that. It's arbitrary, and I think the problem is it sets a precedent across the country, and I think we have to ask, what's next? Do we have to now have a national discussion about what should the parameters be around using the notwithstanding clause? It's a real problem in terms of suspending people's rights and freedoms.
Bob Fife, I've heard this argument, the threshold's too low, but Brad Wall used it in Saskatchewan, the sky didn't fall. They used it in Quebec, the sky didn't fall. He has the right to use it, it's in his toolbox. What's the problem?
Look, this is overkill. It's like stamping out a bug with a jackboot. Yes, it's legal, but it's wrong to do it on such a small issue. And I agree with Ms. Wynne that what the danger you have is that it may enable other provinces or premiers in the future to say, hey, Ontario did it, let's do it ourselves. And if you go back and talk to the premiers at the time, including Bill Davis, who brought in the notwithstanding clause, it was meant for very special circumstances, not to overrule the courts. And I think the problem we have here is that Doug Ford is undermining the judiciary.
Well, I understand the constitutional democracy, Craig, but it actually was not. It was meant to overrule the courts, and times have changed. Some have argued, and other former premiers have argued, that judicial activism has changed, and it is very much within the purview of democratic governments to do this.
I think that what's happened in this case is that the standard is too low. The idea was that this was a legislation as a last resort on something that really affected the power of a province that was important to people in the province, and the Premier felt the sovereignty of their provincial legislatures was being bypassed. So I think in this case, come on, the Toronto City Council, and he looked vindicative, Premier Ford, in doing it, and he looked as if he was saying, in a way, I am above this kind of thing, and I didn't like his approach to it.
Christy.
We're talking about the Premier doing this within the throes of a municipal election. To the former Premier's point, Kathleen Wynne, this is something that caught everyone by surprise in Ontario. And I think that's really the question for the current Premier. Why is it that you feel like you really have to do this? What is the compelling argument as to why the size of Toronto City Council is at the top of mind right out of the gate for you as Premier? I think that's the question a lot of people are asking.
Kathleen Wynne.
I think that is a really important point. In terms of what evidence there is that this is urgent, there isn't any. And that's, I think, the problem. It's a low bar in terms of the issue in the first place, and there's no evidence that this is urgent. And when Doug Ford talks about nothing happening in Toronto and no transit being built, that's just not true, because there is lots of transit being built. There's lots happening in Toronto. So I think that there are a whole lot of problems here. Chaos is being created for something that could create much greater problems across the country in the future.
You know, I looked at the Premier's list of his staff they're all mostly former Harperites. All the people, and you remember Mr. Harper, he didn't like the courts. Remember how he spoke out against the Supreme Court justice? He didn't do the notwithstanding clause, but his thinking was in that direction. And so what Mr. Ford is surrounded by people that like the idea that or believe that the courts have too much power, and they are willing to use the notwithstanding clause in this particular instance, and I'm afraid they may try to do it in others as well.
Well, that's what we got to watch for. The question is it a precedent, and does it get used again in other circumstances? Let me flip to NAFTA, because it's speaking of showdowns, a showdown between Canada and the United States. Every week there's another moment where Chrystia Freeland, the Foreign Affairs Minister, is in Washington. She says, we're close, but there's no deal. The Prime Minister has now upped his rhetoric, Craig, and he's basically saying now, well, we're not going to sign a bad deal. These are arbitrary deadlines, and there are some hills to die on.
Since the very beginning, when the top minister involved at the time said, what we want from you Canadians is concessions. In other words, they want to have a tilt the playing field toward the Americans, and we'll tell you what you get after you give us the concessions. They haven't changed a bit on that. They're sticking with it still, and I think we're right up against it, and we're going to be asking the question soon. As Chrystia Freeland says, we'll question the idea of, is no deal at all as bad as a bad deal?
Well, they've got to make some concessions. It's a deal. So, and the Americans, Bob Fife, want a deal on milk. They want the supply management. If they say we give on that, they can get a deal. But does Justin Trudeau give on that and risk the political blowback in Quebec with an election within the next 400 days?
We have to accept the fact that the Americans are being bullies. They're pushing us around, just like they did the Mexicans, and we're going to get a shave on this. Well, the thing is, and we are willing to give up a lot on dairy, because that's what President Trump wants. He wants to be able to go to Wisconsin and say, hey, I got all this dairy, opened up the dairy market in Canada. But the Prime Minister has said his one takeaway has to be Chapter 19, a dispute mechanism. I think we'll probably get some modification on that. But we don't have to just give in and roll over. There is no deadline, because the clock is ticking on Donald Trump. He's getting weaker every single day. And if he loses the midterms, the whole ball game changes. So the government, we have to accept we're going to get a shave on this, but we don't have to roll over and get kicked in the gut by them either.
Okay, Kathleen Wynne, you weigh in on that, because we could get kicked in the gut if Donald Trump decides in a fit of pique to throw tariffs on the auto industry, especially hurting Ontario.
Yeah, but Evan, you have to, and obviously I was much closer to this a few months ago and was being briefed, but I can tell you that there are dozens of governors across the country and the states who understand that kicking Canada in the gut is going to kick them in the gut as well. And so the big problem we've got here, I think, is that we don't really know what's happening at that table. And the tweets that come out of the White House about the name of the deal, the threats, that bears very little resemblance to what's actually going on at the table, if my experience bears out, because that was what we experienced. What was happening at the table really didn't bear any resemblance to what was coming out of the White House. So we don't know exactly. On the issue around supply management, it is not just Quebec. It is Quebec and Ontario. It is Eastern Ontario. So Eastern Canada. It is the fact that is incredibly important. It's it's $39 billion worth of benefit to Ontario. So if Justin really cares, which he does, about Ontario and Quebec, he is not going to let us take a haircut on supply management, and that's probably one of the things that is tying up the conversation. But it's extremely important. But we just don't know how close they are or how close they are not.
Speaking of the matter of a deadline, though, I think it's pretty clear that this is sapping a lot of battery life out of the Trudeau government. You want to think about looking ahead at the fall sitting in Parliament. Justin Trudeau and the government government are really going to have to focus most of their energy, if not all of their energy, on trying to get a good deal. And again, what defines a good deal? Canadians, I think, are wondering what exactly, what is the status of the talks? There's so much happening. It's hard to even keep track as someone who works in media, let alone being an average Canadian, wondering what is the state of negotiations and what is being advocated for at the table.
Well, sources have told me they're going to give a little bit on dairy, they're going to give a little bit on dispute resolution, and they're going to let Donald Trump do what he's done to hotels, slap his name on it, and let someone else manage the deal. That's the Trump branding. But I got to take a short break. Kathleen Wynne, I really appreciate you joining us as our special guest on the Scrum.
Thanks, Evan.